In the blood-soaked annals of Roman imperial history, few tales capture the depths of human cruelty and desperation quite like the story of Sporus, a beautiful young boy whose destiny became entangled with one of history's most infamous emperors. This isn't simply a tale of political intrigue or military conquest. It is, rather, a haunting exploration of how power can strip away humanity itself, leaving behind nothing but the grotesque theater of imperial whim. Sporus' story unfolds like a nightmare within the marble halls of ancient Rome, where the line between love and possession, between honor and humiliation, dissolved entirely under the mad gaze of Emperor Nero. The year was 65 AD. The Roman Empire stretched from Britain to the Euphrates, its strength seemingly boundless under the rule of Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Yet inside the glittering walls of the Domus Aurea, Nero's golden palace, darkness festered, soon to consume an innocent young life. By this time, the emperor, now in his late 20s, had already shocked Roman society with his theatrical performances, architectural extravagance, and volatile relationships with those closest to him. Rome itself still bore the scars of the Great Fire of 64 AD, and whispers of the emperor's madness drifted through the streets like smoke from the still-smoldering ruins. Amid this world of imperial excess and casual cruelty, young Sporus lived as a freedman within the imperial household. Though technically free, this position offered little protection from the dangerous whims of absolute power. Ancient accounts describe him as possessing an almost otherworldly beauty, delicate features and graceful bearing that would ultimately become both his gift and his doom. Sporus had not sought attention. Rather, it found him in a world where beauty itself could become a currency of suffering. The catalyst for Sporus' tragic transformation was the death of a woman, Poppaea Sabina, Nero's second wife, and the great love of his turbulent life. She died under mysterious circumstances in 65 AD. Some sources claim Nero himself killed her in a fit of rage, kicking her while she was pregnant. Others suggest her death came from complications during childbirth. Regardless of the truth, Poppaea's passing devastated Nero, leaving him consumed with grief that soon curdled into something far more sinister. His mourning became obsessive, driving him to search desperately for ways to resurrect or replace the woman he had claimed to love above all others. It was during this time that fate delivered Sporus into Nero's sight. Whether by chance or design, the young freedman caught the emperor's attention. Nero was struck by what he saw as a haunting resemblance to his dead wife. Ancient historians like Cassius Dio and Suetonius record that Nero became fixated on this similarity, seeing in Sporus' delicate features a chance to reclaim what death had stolen. The emperor's grief-stricken mind conceived a plan so audacious, so horrific, that even jaded Roman society would be left aghast. The decision, when it came, was swift and irreversible. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated, permanently altering the boy's body to better fit the emperor's twisted vision. This was not simply mutilation. It was the complete erasure of Sporus' identity as a man, reshaping him into something that existed solely for Nero's psychological comfort. The operation was carried out by imperial physicians, likely in the sterile luxury of the palace's medical chambers, where screams could be swallowed by marble walls and the boy's protests dismissed as meaningless complaints from property. And then, the true horror of Nero's plan revealed itself. The emperor announced he would marry Sporus in a public ceremony, making the traumatized youth a living replacement for Poppaea. This was not marriage as the Romans knew it, but a grotesque parody, a violation of every social, religious, and legal tradition in the empire. Sporus was renamed Sabina, after the dead empress, and was forced into fine women's clothing, adorned with Poppaea's own jewels. The imperial household was commanded to treat him as empress, addressing him with feminine titles and observing all the rituals of an imperial wife. The wedding ceremony itself was a spectacle of madness, performed in full view of Roman society. Sporus, barely recognizable in elaborate feminine attire, was led through the rituals of Roman marriage while Nero played the role of groom. Ancient accounts describe the scene as both magnificent and deeply disturbing, with all the grandeur of a legitimate imperial wedding masking the true horror beneath. Guests were compelled to participate, offering congratulations and wedding gifts, even as they privately recoiled at the emperor's grotesque theater. After the marriage, Sporus was paraded through Rome as Nero's empress. He was forced to attend public events, ceremonies, and official functions in his feminine guise. Completely dependent on Nero's favor, he had no choice but to perform his assigned role. He accompanied the emperor to the theater, to private dinners, to state gatherings, displayed like a prized object, a living monument to a dead woman. The psychological torment of being compelled to live as someone else, someone whose death may well have been caused by Nero himself, must have been unbearable beyond words. At these public appearances, Romans watched in uneasy silence as their emperor walked hand in hand with what seemed to be a beautiful young woman. But beneath the facade, they knew the truth. Even in a society accustomed to imperial eccentricity, this display deeply disturbed many. The sight of Sporus, dressed as empress yet marked by the subtle traces of his true identity and the consequences of his mutilation, stood as a chilling reminder of how absolute power could warp not only morality but reality itself. The so-called relationship between Nero and Sporus, if it can even be called that, was built on the emperor's obsession and the young man's helplessness. Nero treated Sporus as both cherished wife and treasured possession, showering him with lavish gifts and attention, while at the same time stripping away his agency, denying him any identity beyond that of Poppaea's replacement. Nero would address him by the dead wife's name, speak to him as though he were truly her, and demand that he respond in character. This constant psychological torture, being forced to embody another's identity while his own was systematically erased, was cruelty that surpassed even physical suffering. Ancient writers offer glimpses into this bizarre arrangement. Suetonius tells us that Nero even took Sporus on tours of Greece, presenting him to dignitaries and aristocrats as his empress. For Sporus, these journeys must have been unbearable. Trapped in foreign lands, surrounded by strangers who either believed the performance or were forced to pretend they did. The mask could never be dropped, the performance never ended. His very self was a prison from which there was no escape. Nero's treatment of Sporus also revealed the depths of his own fractured mind. His love for Poppaea had been possessive and violent in life, and his obsession with her replacement carried the same dangerous intensity. He would fly into rages whenever Sporus failed to perfectly embody the lost empress, punishing him for flaws that existed only in Nero's imagination. Yet, in turn, he could also show moments of tenderness, showering Sporus with gifts and affection in the same way he once had with Poppaea, trapping the young man in a cycle of reward and abuse. The experience was psychologically devastating. As the months passed, the bizarre nature of this arrangement became increasingly clear to everyone in the imperial household. Servants and courtiers were forced to navigate the complex etiquette of addressing Sporus as empress, all the while knowing the truth of his situation. They witnessed his daily humiliations, the constant need to maintain a feminine persona, and the heavy psychological toll it inflicted on the young man. Some may have felt pity, others disgust, but all were complicit in upholding the elaborate lie that had become the cornerstone of Nero's fragile emotional stability. The strain of this existence marked every detail of Sporus' daily life. He was required to wear women's clothing at all times, to speak in a way considered fitting for an empress, and to engage in conversations and activities that reinforced his forced identity. The surgical mutilation he had endured made certain aspects of this disguise easier to sustain, but it also stood as a constant physical reminder of what had been taken from him. Every movement, every word, every gesture had to be carefully measured in order to maintain the illusion that he was the woman Nero so desperately wanted him to be. The political implications of Nero's actions were not lost on the Senate and the wider Roman elite. The emperor's marriage to Sporus was viewed as another glaring sign of his unraveling mind and his open contempt for Roman tradition. Though few dared to voice their criticism openly, private letters and conversations reveal the shock and disgust of many Romans. The spectacle of their emperor parading a castrated boy dressed as his dead wife was taken as a symbol of the moral rot infecting the empire's highest offices. And so, this strange situation carried on for several years. Sporus remained trapped in his role as Nero's false empress, unable to escape, unable even to express his true feelings. The psychological wounds from years of forced identity erasure, combined with the trauma of castration and the constant strain of sustaining such a deception, left their marks. Contemporary sources suggest Sporus grew increasingly withdrawn and melancholic, though he had little choice but to continue performing the part he had been assigned. Nero's attachment to Sporus became so complete that he at times seemed to believe he had truly resurrected his beloved Poppaea. This delusion created moments of tenderness between the two, but it only deepened the horror of Sporus' reality. He was not merely acting a role. He was expected to become someone else entirely, to surrender his identity so completely that even he might forget who he once was. The relationship, with its twisted mixture of love, obsession, cruelty, and delusion, defies simple definition, even by the standards of an age steeped in imperial excess. Meanwhile, Nero's reign was fraying at the edges. Political tensions across the empire neared breaking point. His obsession with theatrical pursuits, his neglect of state affairs, and his increasingly erratic behavior alienated allies and emboldened rivals. Military commanders in distant provinces began questioning their loyalty to an emperor who seemed more intent on dressing up a castrated boy than on governing Rome's vast territories. The sight of Sporus, draped in imperial finery and paraded as empress, became a living emblem of everything wrong with Nero's rule. By 68 AD, the empire's fragile balance shattered. The Praetorian Guard, the Senate, and several provincial governors declared themselves against Nero. Facing total rejection and the certainty of a brutal death if captured, the emperor fled Rome with a handful of loyal followers, including Sporus. The boy who had once had no choice in his fate now found himself chained to a collapsing emperor, his survival bound to a man who had already destroyed him in every imaginable way. The final days of Nero's reign unfolded in chaos and fear as news of rebellions and betrayals poured in. The emperor's behavior became even more erratic, swinging between fantasies of escape and delusions of staging some final, grand theatrical performance. Through all of this, Sporus remained by his side, still in feminine attire, still forced to play the part of the devoted empress, even as the empire itself disintegrated around them. He must have realized by then that his fate was inseparable from Nero's, that the emperor's end would almost certainly be his own. When Nero finally committed suicide in June 68 AD, reportedly with the help of his secretary, Euphrates, Sporus was left adrift in a terrifying uncertainty. The emperor's death brought him no freedom. Instead, it ushered in a new and equally nightmarish chapter. As one of the most visible symbols of Nero's reign, Sporus embodied both the memory of imperial decadence and the potential for political utility. In the power struggles that erupted after Nero's fall, every faction had its own plans for the young man who had once been forced into the role of empress. In the immediate aftermath, Sporus was treated less as a person and more as spoils of war. He was passed from one powerful man to another, a prize or trophy rather than a human being with any say in his own life. The new emperor, Galba, reportedly claimed possession of Sporus along with other remnants of Nero's household. This was not liberation. It was simply another transaction in which Sporus had no voice. Once a free citizen, then a mutilated plaything, he had now become a symbol of victory, a political token for whoever could lay claim to him. Under Galba, Sporus' situation remained precarious and humiliating. Though Galba lacked Nero's obsessive theatrics, he still saw value in keeping this living relic of the fallen emperor. Sporus was held in a form of gilded captivity. He was no longer publicly paraded as empress, but he was still expected to preserve aspects of his feminine presentation. His existence hung in a cruel limbo, neither fully male nor female, neither free nor enslaved, neither honored nor discarded. For someone who had already suffered years of identity erasure, this half-life must have been psychologically shattering. The political turmoil that followed Nero's fall, the infamous year of the 4 emperors, kept Sporus' fate uncertain. As one ruler rose and another fell, the young man was passed along like an inheritance of empire. When Galba was assassinated in January 69 AD, Sporus once again found himself in new hands. He had become like a piece of imperial property, valued, coveted, and transferred, but never allowed to be simply himself. Each shift brought new humiliations, each ruler their own expectations, stripping away more of whatever dignity he still clung to. Otho, who briefly seized power after Galba, is said to have treated Sporus with comparative kindness, perhaps seeing something of his own fragility in the young man's plight. Yet Otho's reign lasted only months before he too was defeated and driven to suicide. And once again, Sporus faced the dread of being claimed by yet another master. Each transition tore away another piece of his battered identity. It was under Vitellius that Sporus' ordeal sank to its final, most degrading stage. Vitellius, who defeated Otho and claimed the purple for himself, devised a cruel fate for the boy. He planned to use Sporus not as a consort, not even as a captive symbol of power, but as entertainment for the masses. The emperor intended to force the young man into the arena, not as a gladiator, but as a participant in a grotesque reenactment of the rape of. The plan was to stage the mythological scene of Persephone, the abduction and violation of a young maiden. For Sporus, this represented the ultimate degradation. He was to be forced into the role of a woman being sexually assaulted before thousands of jeering spectators. The thought of this final humiliation proved unbearable. After years of forced feminization, identity erasure, and sexual exploitation, the idea of being publicly violated as entertainment for the Roman mob became the breaking point. Ancient sources tell us that Sporus chose death, rather than endure such cruelty. Before Vitellius could carry out his plan, Sporus took his own life. In that final act, Sporus reclaimed the one thing denied him throughout his ordeal, the power to choose his own fate. His suicide marked the end of one of the darkest and most disturbing episodes in Roman imperial history. His death was not widely mourned. It was not considered a significant political event. By then, he had been so dehumanized that his passing was remarked upon only as a minor disruption to Vitellius' entertainment plans. Yet in choosing death over further degradation, Sporus displayed a courage and dignity systematically stripped from him during his life. His last act was not just a rejection of the grotesque role he had been forced to play. It was an assertion of his fundamental humanity. The story of Sporus forces us to face uncomfortable truths about power and the human capacity for cruelty. In a world where absolute authority could transform a free young man into a living doll, where identity itself could be surgically and psychologically reshaped to suit the desires of a mad ruler, we see reflected the darkest possibilities of unchecked power. Sporus' tragedy was not merely personal. It was a symptom of a system that valued people only for how they could serve those in command. His story reminds us that behind the grand narratives of empire and conquest lie countless individual tragedies, lives destroyed by forces they could not resist. His experience highlights the vulnerabilities of those living at the margins of Roman society: freedmen, slaves, and others whose existences could be erased at the whim of the powerful. That his story was recorded at all speaks to its exceptional nature. Yet it also suggests that similar abuses, perhaps less dramatic but equally devastating, were commonplace in a society built on rigid hierarchies and absolute imperial power. Modern readers may ask, how could such cruelty be possible? How could a society tolerate, or even celebrate, such systematic dehumanization? And yet, Sporus' story also reveals the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to endure unimaginable suffering while still clinging to some core sense of self. His final choice, tragic though it was, stands as a kind of victory, a refusal to be utterly broken, even by powers that seemed able to rewrite reality itself. In remembering Sporus, we honor not only his suffering, but also his final, defiant act against those who sought to erase his humanity completely.